February 27th, 2024. Excuse me. I'm going to be your host tonight, Dana Durnford. I'm also known as the Nuclear Proctologist.org. That's the wrong one. There we go. We'll get there. And you can call in at 709-589-4406. 709-589-4406. Everybody had a great day. Great big day for everybody. So we're going to step back and go through some headlines from March 11, 2011, which was the day of the tsunami, to about the 15th, 16th. If we got time. And we're going to compare the official story back then with the story that was being promoted by the media. And we're going to do that because you can see how the cover-up played out and how the nuclear industry betrayed the planet and the species. We got a poll tonight asking an interesting question. Did the nuclear industry cover up the Fukushima meltdowns because the radioactive fallout is a bioweapon? The radioactive fallout is a bioweapon. And that's what doctors in the 50s described radioactive fallout was as a bioweapon, particularly for children, for instance, because it was so noticeable. We'll just jump right into it. So this story is the 12th of March, 2011. And Japan's nuclear accident worst and worst again. That was the day Reactor 1 detonated. Now the official story is this was a hydrogen explosion. And it didn't compromise the fuel pools. It didn't compromise the reactor cores. Now that's the fuel pools are right. The top of the fuel pools are right there level with the panels that are still intact. So let's say it didn't compromise the fuel pools. What it meant was then that the fuel pools were now in the open. They were exposed to the elements, and we didn't see any mitigation type attempts or anything like that. We didn't see them trying to inject water into it or anything like that, which means that they melted down. This was an interesting statement from the author. Actually, every major nuclear accident has been worse than the worst case, and that's a fact every nuclear advocate, and this one included, will have to take into account. As we learn in the global financial crisis as well, instruments and devices thought of as separate entities can all go south as the result of a single underlying cause, upending estimates of how serious and consequential any one failure would be. So in other words, they couldn't plan for it. And this was a forewarning, I would imagine, for the next million years. This is also March the 12th, 2011. This is the day after the tsunami. Situation, the nuclear emergency from the beginning of Japan's earthquake. So again, this is just the day after, so you're not going to get the entire scope of it. But as we get up to around day 15, day 16, now today I was supposed to go through the Freedom of Information Act's files that were released from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I did start out the day that way. And when I started looking for some of the stuff that they were talking about, because I'm a sucker for punishment, I came across this site with all these stories on it, and I decided to go down that rabbit path because it seemed appropriate at the time. And now here we are tonight. I was at work today, so I'm busted up a little bit, but The news arm of the World's Nuclear Association, which is a lobbying group, citing TEPCO as it's a nuclear lobbying group, rather, citing TEPCO as its source. So pressure within the reactor reached 840 kilopascals, about twice the normal level. To reduce the pressure, TEPCO has been releasing filtered radioactive steam into the atmosphere, resulting in some radiation leakages. So you got this big complex, and you got a tsunami that rolls through it. How much equipment do you think is going to work? So if this was your house, for instance, your property, your neighborhood, and this tsunami came through at enormous speeds and volumes, how much do you think is going to be working as it recedes? Now, this model here is based on the venting. And this model in the top left-hand corner is based on 20 days of emissions from the venting. It's not based on the actual inventories from the nuclear meltdowns. TEPCO, which is, they're not a decommission authority, by the way, they're just barely an operator, have been releasing filtered radioactive steam into the atmosphere. So this is what the country looked like the day before. You had a tsunami run through the side, and there's nothing that's going to be working. So you can't release filtered radioactive steam into the atmosphere. TEPCO later notified the government that the water cooling system in its Fukushima Daiichi 2 plant, which is the Daini plant, located 12 kilometers north. This is supposed to be an exact replica of the Daiichi plant. North of the Daiichi 1 plant had failed the water cooling system. All 4 of its reactors had been shut down automatically, but you can't shut it down without water. Here we go again. I apologize. I'll do that off the camera here. All 4 of its reactors have been shut down automatically. The company added was bringing in mobile electric generators to restore power to the system. And residents living within 10 kilometers of the Daini plant, which is different from the Daiichi plant, were evacuated. So this would have happened at the Daini plant, basically, too. It was an exact replica, built at the same elevations. And the tsunami done this to 1,200 miles of the coastline were severely impacted. According to Japan's Nuclear Industrial Safety Agency, radiation 1,000 times normal levels, which nobody knows what that is, was detected inside the TEPCO Daiichi 1 plant control room, and levels 8 times normal. So 1,000 times normal inside the control room, but 8 times normal outside the control room. The control room is not connected to the nuclear plant. So how does that work? So in May 2011, International Atomic Energy Agency was informed in March that the number 1 reactor core started melting about 50 minutes after the cooling stopped. So 50 minutes after the tsunami. And there was a melted pile of fuel in 3.5 hours. But when the fuel melts down, it melts down at such enormous temperature, it doesn't just stop into a pile. It goes deep into the earth. It leaves the containment vessel. The containment vessel gets sliced through like the proverbial hot knife through butter. The company added it was bringing in mobile electric generators to restore power to the system. This is the Daini plant. The Daini plant was severely flooded. Let me see if I can find that. I don't know as I can. Just take a second. You know, doing the things I do comes with a great responsibility and a burden on your soul. And when there's nobody else out there educating the population, articulating the issues, it's more of a burden, right? And when you have very little help, and I'm under siege from the nuclear industry, almost 13 full years now. And when I say the word siege, that's exactly what I am. I'm under siege. This industry has wrecked my life in order to try to upend me, right? And they basically succeeded. The only thing is I'm too stubborn to concede defeat. Maybe I'm not going to find the Dini. There we go. Just pure look. So the Dini was submerged under 4 meters of water, 12 feet of water. So it had severe damage, right? Because there's no oxygen in the containers. There was no explosion in the containers, so there was no damage. It said in Edano, which, as you'll see coming up, and we've showed already, is a perpetual law, that there was no great amount of radiation leak. This is on the 12th, remember? Earlier, he said TEPCO had begun venting steam from the container, which is Reactor 1 building you're talking about, to reduce the growing pressure inside. He's talking about the containment, rather. As a result, now, you couldn't reduce the containment because you had a tsunami run through there. There's no longer anything functional. You can't go turning knobs or pushing buttons or running on batteries or hook up generators or patch cords or wires or blah, blah, blah. There's nothing you can do. You're talking about a catastrophic tsunami has swept through your entire coastline. After the explosion, I'm talking about number 1, at the Fukushima plant, the pressure inside the container fell. Now the container is the reactor itself, right? The reactor is contained, and I can't even remember the name for some reason. At the same time, the density of radiation also fell to 860 microsieverts. So you had a detonation and the radiation numbers went down instead of up. And by 6:45 p.m. it fell further, and at a time about microsieverts, there's 1,000 microsieverts in a sievert. And so when you vented, you were well over sieverts. So it can't, when you have a detonation, it doesn't fall. And what detonated was the fuel pool, which could have easily had decades of reactor cores into it. And typically did, as all nuclear power plants have those particular attributes, because you don't have a repository anywhere worldwide to store it. So by 6:48 p.m. on the 12th, March the 12th, 2011, it fell further to 70 microsieverts. 70 millionth of a sievert after the detonation. Numbers in May 2011 were showing 225 sieverts per hour at the number 1 reactor. 3 sieverts is a lethal dose to a homeless person. We don't know if it'll kill a nuclear scientist because he never went there. TEPCO has now decided to flood the container with seawater to bring down the temperature. So first off, the buildings were flooded. They were destroyed. There was nothing functional. You couldn't do nothing there. There was nothing functional anymore. You couldn't just go pump seawater into the reactor core. And boric acid will also be added to prevent a nuclear criticality. Now, the fuel pool, rather, was what blew up originally. As that melted down, that went straight down below it was the reactor core, which is, at the same height, right? So they would have lost that too. And now we know in hindsight that liquefied. We've never seen a liquefied uranium core in history. So you weren't skipping around the site, twisting valves, and even if you were, none of the valves would have been working. And Edano, there was speculation, given the need to use seawater, which is the last thing you want to use, that the water pipes feeding the system must have been damaged by the earthquake / tsunami. Would have damaged everything. Wouldn't you agree? Several nuclear experts speaking on national television said that if the light water reactors were to go into meltdown, they wouldn't explode or affect people outside the 10-kilometer safety zone that had been set up. Like, how do you set up a safety zone when radioactive fallout doesn't respect the borders, right? And up to the top left-hand corner is 20 days. So the safety zone has to be the entire planet for that to work, let alone 10 kilometers. They wouldn't explode. Of course, they exploded. This was a couple of days later, and we'll get to that coming up. Reactor 3, for instance, is very visible that that's exploded, right? And it's the same thing for Reactor 4. Professor Masaki Saito of the Department of Nuclear Engineering at the Tokyo Institute of Technology said there's no possibility of a disaster like the one that happened in 1986 at Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Of course, in hindsight, he knew better, and he'd done that as part of his tenure. That's his job, is to come out and protect the industry if something happens, right? And to brainwash the children going to the university to grow up to be evil scum like him. Tokyo area, a couple of 100 kilometers away, soil testing finds radioactivity up to Chernobyl's relocation levels, 919,000 atoms per square meter. NHK, Japan's National Broadcasting Organization, because we cover that media a lot, right? But that's one of the, and Japan Times are the major mouthpieces for the Japanese government, the degenerate Japanese government. Reported midday Sunday that the cooling system controlling Fukushima Daiichi 1 plant's number 3 boiling water reactor, rated at 784 megawatts, has failed. The cooling system. This is on the 12th. Forcing the company to vent filtered steam also into the atmosphere, mirroring the emergency measures taken yesterday when the same situation arose for the number 1 reactor. You're not going to go in there and filter anything or turn any valves or get anything to work after that went through the site. That's how it works. That was destroyed the infrastructure, the complete infrastructure. March the 14th, a second explosion damages Japan's nuclear plant, and a third blast could follow. On the 4th day after Japan's massive earthquake, the nuclear emergency continues to worsen. This was the detonation of Reactor 3. So there wasn't a nuclear scientist on the entire planet that looked at that explosion. That was on the TV on the 14th. So on the 14th, March the 14th, 3 days after the tsunami, there wasn't a nuclear scientist on the planet that didn't know the fuel pools in the reactor cores were gone, and they remained silent now for 13 years. But there wasn't a single academic in nuclear industry, there wasn't a single professor in universities in the nuclear industry, a single nuclear corporation on the entire planet that didn't know the fuel pools were gone and the reactor cores were gone. Not one. Yet, even today, they refuse to acknowledge it. In 2021, they claim they got all the fuel out of the pool when the actual building doesn't even exist. So that was the 14th of March 2011, 3 days after the tsunami. And this is what it looked like. The reactor core and the fuel pools were at the top of the buildings. There's zero top of buildings. These are gone. And the video of the detonation clearly showed the reactor core and the fuel pool falling back down to Earth. Which I believe is this picture, video right here. Right, so you're going to see large pieces falling back down to Earth as the plume rises. This video slowed down. But those big chunks you're looking at is the fuel pools in the reactor cores. And this is I apologize. I usually like to. I had that in my lineup to tell a story, and I click it all the time now, unfortunately. So this is Reactor 3. And basically, that was Harvard University saying that all the helicopter pilots at Chernobyl died. So ultimately, Reactor 3 and Reactor 4, that's Reactor 3 over there that we're talking about, there's nothing left to it. And this is the stump of Reactor 4. So both of those stumps should have been razed all the way to the ground. Both of them, what they done was they put these contraptions above them, they built off-site, and then used that to make outrageous claims they got the fuel out of the pool. You can't get fuel out of the pool when the building no longer exists. Call this industry evil doesn't quite do it justice. It's on a whole different class of evil. And the only way to describe it is a hateful industry. And it's a genocidal industry. And that the emissions are bioweapons. Let me get back down to this stuff. So March the 14th, Reactor 3 detonated. Today at around 11 a.m. local time, a hydrogen explosion. These weren't hydrogen explosions. So the idea of the hydrogen explosion was so you didn't mention the word nuclear meltdown, because that's what creates the hydrogen. But like in fracking, they use explosives deep into the earth, and then they'll seed it with several or 8 grams of uranium, depleted uranium, and that will cause the detonation extremely powerful all of a sudden. It'll multiply by many magnitudes. And so it's the same thing when the building blew up. The aerosol of the uranium plutonium is the detonation from, and the hydrogen was just a fuse. The detonation occurred in the structure housing the unstable number 3 reactor. Unstable. This came 2 days after a similar explosion occurred at the plant's number 1 reactor. And judging by the size of the new smoke plume and visible damage to the structure's framework, today's explosion, and so they're talking about the plume and the framework on the 14th. Edano said that radiation monitoring after the blast not shown a significant increase in radiation. Edano again. So how can you lose multiple fuel pools in multiple buildings and an undeniable detonation of the reactor cores and say there was no increase in radiation? It's an inherently evil industry, is what we see constantly with this industry. And that the players, the public players, actors that we see in this industry, the only way to describe them is sadistic and soulless and heartless. Particularly groups like the World Nuclear News or the World Nuclear Association, which are lobbying groups. Tokyo Electric Power Company, which operates the plant, have been pumping seawater into the number 3 reactor to cool it down. Now the government is warning that a similarly dangerous situation is building in a number 2 reactor. It's still the 14th, right? March the 14th, 2011. News service later reported that the water levels in the number 2 reactor had fallen to fully expose the fuel rods, which likely caused some of them to partially fuse. Now, while the zirconium cladding, when it's exposed to water, immediately catches fire, and it burns at around 1800 degrees. And inside the cladding of the fuel rods is uranium plutonium pellets. And so they'll burn up to 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. And this will evaporate all the water in the pool pretty quick, within moments. And this will cause a criticality event. What's the proper name for it? An excursion event, aka detonation. News service later reported the water levels in number 2 reactor fully exposed to fuel rods, so they melted down on the 14th. Goto, which used to work for General Electric, I believe, said that the base, he quit, right? So that based on the reports, it seems the mobile pump being used to push seawater in number 2 reactor had run out of fuel. But there was no mobile pump to push water in the number 2, because when number 3 detonated, number 1 detonated, it tossed fuel assemblies all over the site. And so you couldn't survive walking around on the site. And in hindsight, we know this, because they were using remote control bulldozers much later to bury incredibly dangerous radioactivity around the site. It was a no man's land. And that the footage that we do have, and let me bring up some of that from the original. We have a lot of it, actually. When they were spraying water, they weren't by the reactor spraying water. They were on the ocean side of the pump house. So the reactors are on the other side of that building, and they only had one pump truck. And so it's complete fable to suggest that they were pushing seawater into the number 2 reactor. He didn't know what kind of pump was being used because it wasn't. Nagoto earned his PhD by evaluating the stress that reactor container vessels can endure, and he quit his job with Toshiba, not General Electric's corporation, due to his concerns over reactor safety. I came to the conclusion that the containment vessels being built were not adequate enough to be the last line of defense. And they weren't designed, well, nothing is designed in reality, to withstand the kind of problems being experienced at the Fukushima plant. He now teaches design engineering at the Shibaru Institute of Technology in Tokyo. However, the government sounded one cautiously optimistic note today. Edano, a perpetual lawyer, claimed that none of the troubled reactors were likely to experience a total meltdown. Now, that was after a total nuclear meltdown that same day. So the cover story immediately was to deny. And 13 years later, now they have compromised the integrity of the planet due to radioactive fallout, which is a bioweapon. Implications of a second Japanese reactor meltdown on March the 13th. So I skipped the day, now we're going back to the 13th. I put it in the wrong spot. I apologize. With the news Sunday that a second unit at the Fukushima 1 nuclear power plant, the Daiichi plant, is probably suffering a meltdown. That was on the 13th. So on the 14th, they were denying a meltdown. On the 13th, they were suggesting it was a meltdown. The possibility of second containment building explosion also cannot be excluded, and the grave implication of a disastrous accident are beginning to sink in. The previous days, reports accumulated of radioactive cesium and iodine readings outside the plant, cesium and iodine. Because you can find out with your Geiger counter. But in this scenario, you would assume that they would equate it immediately and appropriately with uranium, plutonium, and curium as the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rods. So this is the day before the last story. Cesium and iodine are fission products. That is, they are created when fissile uranium splits, and their presence outside a reactor vessel implies not merely that a meltdown has taken place, but even more seriously that the vessel has somehow been breached. Now it's true you can suggest that this was due to the fuel pool at number 1, right? But in reality, they actually are, it was both, right? Let's put it that way. It was both a meltdown and a criticality, a nuclear meltdown, and a detonation of the fuel pools at the number 1 reactor. Because once the number 1 reactor detonated on March the 12th, there was nothing else you can do after that. It threw fuel rods and reactor cores all over the site. There was no surviving anybody walking around. By today, March the 13th, in North America, official word has come that the Unit 1 core almost certainly is melted. And now they know, in hindsight, and they knew back then, by the way, within 50 minutes of the tsunami, the reactor core was melting down. And then, because it heated up, and that set off the fuel pool above it. And that the Unit 3 core was likely melting too. And when you look at the pictures of Reactor 3, the official original pictures, now this was the next day, and so as the reactor core melted and breached the containment, it detonated. And that was the detonation that we seen earlier. I showed you videos and pictures of earlier. A press release from the Tokyo Electric Power Company said that the water containing boric acid was being injected into the Unit 3 vessel. You weren't injecting. Well, this is the day before that happened, so you still weren't injecting it because you had spread the fuel pool of Reactor 1 all over the site. And you had a tsunami run through the site. Let me go back. So you had a tsunami run through the site, but it ran through the whole country too. Not the whole country, but 1,200 miles of the coastline. In some places up to 10 kilometers inland. And so you weren't running around turning valves and flicking knobs and hooking up car batteries or any other of the 1,000 lies they told you. The real story, the true story is here right now. And I'm telling it to you. The press release from the Tokyo Electric Power Company said that the water containing boric acid was injected in Unit 3 vessel in an attempt to stop reactivity and cool the core in what was generally seen as a Hail Mary, like a puncher's chance. You ever heard the expression puncher's chance? Where even the worst, if you got a professional boxer and you got a novice who never boxed in their life, rather, the novice can still win with a Hail Mary, a so-called Hail Mary, where they can still punch if they catch the professional boxer on the chin. They can still, I'm only laughing because I just remember the story from way back when, because I used to be in Taekwondo, right? And at the time I was the highest student they had, which meant I was a perfect punching bag for the instructor. And Master Chang was an 8th-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and he was from South Korea. He had immigrated to Canada when he was young as a 4th-degree black belt. And back in those days, that was considered, oh my goodness, right? So, to my horror, he came to where I was too for promotions because I was thoroughly intimidated by him. He was an 8th-degree black belt. Super nice guy, though. But anyway, I was young. I used to club at night times quite a bit. So the weekend was here, and I was going to go clubbing that night. And so we were clubbing, and Master Chang and the instructor, my brother, who was good friends with him, showed up at the club. And I remember being terrified that whole night. But anyway, the next day was promotion, and we were sitting around after promotion at the instructor's house. And I was asking him, I said, Master Chang, let's say you're in a place where there's a lot of noise, and I came up behind you with a baseball bat and hit you in the head. Could I knock you out? And I remember the horror on my instructor's face as I said it. And Master Chang, you're like, no, it's okay, Wes. Yes, Dana, I'm just human. You can knock me out with that. He said, but you better knock me out. And I remember those words for the rest of my life. You better make sure you knock me out. Because basically those people, if they see it coming, let's put it this way, you can try to kick them in the testicles and they can withdraw their testicles up into their body cavity before you can kick them in the testicle. Because they're so tuned in. That's the legend anyway. And I'm not kidding, by the way. TEPCO had injected seawater as well as boric acid into the Unit 1 core, which was detonated the day before. And we know how that played out. The reactor blew up. Now, of course, they didn't inject seawater into the reactor core because they had a tsunami run through the site. TEPCO press release also said that a buildup of hydrogen in a Unit 3 outer containment building could not be excluded and that it too might explode. So this was the 13th, right? And I already done the 14th, which I apologize because that was supposed to be in order. The Japanese Prime Minister declared the general crisis in Sendai and surrounding territories the nation's worst, which is Prime Minister Khan, since the end of World War II. So talking about the tsunami, the earthquake, and the nuclear meltdowns. 3 strikes and humanity was out. The new emergency core cooling system would exclude the kind of meltdowns that appeared to have taken place in Unit 1 and 3. And so it's interesting that on the 13th, they were saying meltdowns at Unit 1 and 3. Now, the next day, Unit 3 detonated, right? Which was from the core melting down, heating up so much that it breached the containment, dried out the pool above it, and then it detonated. As reactors are being relicensed around the world to keep operating beyond their intended 40-year lifetime, the original charters for nuclear was for 30 years. And the reason that they had a 30-year limit was because they understood back then the Wigner effect, which was the embrittlement of the metal and the structure and the cement and everything else from the neutron, gamma shines, X-rays, beta rays, and that effect will break down the integrity of everything. And because the pressure in these are over 1,000 pounds per square inch, then the metal becomes fatigued, and in this case is known as brittle, much more worse. And if you got a high pressure, these things will explode. So the explosion at Reactor 3, for instance, was because it became so brittle, it was at such a high pressure, that when it finally breached, it was like a car tire. When you put too much air into it, and what happened? It blows up, right? So imagine 1,000 pounds per square inch in it. Explosion at the damaged, this is back to March the 12th. Explosion at the damaged Japanese nuclear plant. A little radiation leaked. So this is very bad pictures back in those days. But this wasn't a little radiation leak. This was decades of reactor cores detonating. Now it's true that Japan have shipped a lot of reactor cores to La Hague in France and to Sellafield and Donneray in the United Kingdom. But the story is at Fukushima they didn't do that. But other reactors were doing that. The scientific state Japan's nuclear emergency and the future of nuclear power. In other words, this was day 12, or the 12th of March, the next day. So when the fuel pool detonated, that site was no longer you couldn't survive walking around on the site. Let's put it that way. So you couldn't inject water, you couldn't put boric acid, you couldn't go near the site or the buildings because they're all clumped together. The scientific state that Japan's nuclear emergency, the future of nuclear power, and Japan's crisis is a setback for humanity's attempt. As the scale of Japan's nuclear emergency emerges, experts in Japan and the United States say the country now faces many problems with its crippled, and that word should never be used in a nuclear site, reactors, and they worry that the radioactive releases of steam, that's not radioactive steam, but radioactive releases of steam, could go on for weeks or even months. Actually, it'll never stop, right? There, of course, the ill health effects of radiation releases from the Japan's stricken reactors, the effects that could extend far beyond Japan's borders and its people. And these radiation releases will occur even if Japan avoids a full meltdown of nuclear cores in the 2 reactors. And even if these meltdowns are avoided, the calamities are the worst experienced by a nuclear power operator since Chernobyl 25 years ago. So even today, they say Chernobyl is the world's worst accident. And this model in the top hand corner of 20 days articulates their concern. It covered the whole planet in about 20 days. And while a repeat of the Chernobyl disaster isn't likely at this point, confidence in nuclear power has taken a gigantic hit. The breakdown in nuclear safety systems in Japan has done grave damage to the elusive dream of expanding nuclear power in the hopes of bringing on more sources of energy that don't expand the emissions of greenhouse gas. And nuclear is the biggest emission of greenhouse gases. It's the biggest polluter on the planet. And is that one there? This one here? That one there? Okay, so think of the plume up there on March 31st, 2011. It's not just Xenon 133 in that plume, which was at 450,000 times detection levels. It's something we've never seen before. But think of that plume at 20 days. So in 20 days, you got a plume covering the majority of the planet. And think of it as a snowstorm. So instead of thinking of the atoms, physical atoms, think of as snowflakes, because you can see the snowflakes. And you know they're clumped together, they fall very tight together, right? And that's important to appreciate the complexity. And it's not that complex when you articulate it this way. So you got an invisible snowstorm after 20 days covering the majority of the planet in this particular model. Now, because you're using xenon, let's switch that out for uranium, plutonium, or curium, which is the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rod, and basically never goes away. And now, so each snowflake, which is actually an atom, but we'll visualize it as a snowflake, is pulsing energy almost at the speed of light, and the gammas will pulse around 600 feet each second. Pure energy, almost at the speed of light, and we don't have anything else on the planet Earth that can do that. And this is anthropogenic man-made stuff that's doing it. And we don't have an autoimmune trigger to defend against it. Okay. But anyway, the plume covers the entire planet. Think of it as a snowstorm covering the planet. The snow never melts, and it never stops snowing, and it never goes away. Instead, it's a snowstorm, invisible snowstorm of radioactive fallout. It never goes away. It never stops pulsing energy almost at the speed of light. And so there's no other element, natural elements on the planet that does that. Carbon emissions don't make plumes that covers the planet. And carbon's so big it doesn't fall very far from a source on top of that. Right? So they've been misleading you to think of carbon as your enemy. But carbon, you can't. If you got no carbon, then Earth would look like the moon. everything is dependent upon carbon. Carbon is life itself, see? It's recycled, and it always has been that way. But nuclear, you have an invisible plume covering the entire planet from the bottom of the ocean floor to the upper troposphere, pulsing energy at the speed of light. And every day you got 1,000 fuel pools doing that to your planet worldwide. Each fuel pool is capable of creating a plume like that because those particular models you're looking at are based on the venting, not based on the actual meltdowns and the inventories that were lost. And so when I say to you, did the nuclear industry cover up the Fukushima meltdowns because radioactive fallout is a bioweapon? This is what I mean by it. It covers the whole planet immediately, and you can't escape it. The insects, the birds, the mammals, the animals are extremely vulnerable. And so particularly the insects, because in the forest now they're getting full body x-rays from these permanent assault upon the biosphere, and they become sterilized quite quickly compared to humans. We will follow, and we do, and we have. But the insects first will start to disappear, and then 50% of the birds are insect eaters. And so they'll disappear because the hatchlings will fail, and eventually they'll fail. So the majority of the birds, small birds you're seeing right now are seed eaters. Some leading politicians took to Sunday talk shows and other venues to say that the Japanese crisis should prompt at least a pause in the United States' efforts to restart the country's nuclear industry, if not put an end to it. And like the U.S. didn't have a nuclear renaissance at this time. A Vermont governor, a Democrat, said Japan's crisis illustrated what a Vermont Yankee nuclear plant should not operate after next year because it's exceeded its original charter. And the charter was there to protect you from embrittlement caused by the neutron bombardment, the beta rays, the gamma shines, the x-rays and everything else. The day before the Japan's earthquake, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission extended the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant's license for 20 years beyond 2012, when its original license was set to expire. And because the nuclear industry wasn't building any reactors, they have sabotaged your future by extending the lives of these emitters. These are nuclear power plants should best be described as a disease factory. And the fuel pools at all nuclear power plants have no containment, and they're still splitting atoms. And that's hemorrhaged into your environment at a copious amount that compromises the integrity of your genetics, your DNA, your chromosomes, and ultimately wrecks the ecosystem because of its insidious attributes, and that is toxic to everything with replicating cells. And so nothing with replicating cells has an autoimmune trigger to defend against it. We defend against it by attacking it relentlessly for the rest of our lives with white blood cells, which will compromise, as you get bioaccumulate more into your body, that compromises your immune system and makes you more susceptible to pathogens and viruses that were normally harmless and innocuous and benign. We act as if they can be run beyond their design lives when engineering is primitive compared to what one would build today. Right, the majority of nuclear power plants that exist today are primitive to what we would build if we had hindsight today, right? There is no nuclear renaissance currently. Last year, in 2023, nuclear went backwards 1.7 gigawatts, and renewables gained 507 gigawatts, which is the animosity equivalent of over 600 large nuclear reactors coming online in renewables in 12 months. This is stunning. And because the price of commodities have exploded due to the the false flag event in Ukraine and Russia, excuse me, it's still extraordinary that over 507 gigawatts of new renewable energies came online in 12 months because it's so expensive to try to build them now due to that particular attribute of inflation, artificial inflation, caused by United Nations. I think the tragedy in Japan should awaken a re-examination of our irrational exuberance about running our aging plants, nuclear plants, beyond their design life. Okay, we're going to move ahead to the 15th of March. This is 4 days after the tsunami. The spent fuel pool was what they're talking about. Danger in Japan's nuclear disaster. The Union of Unconcerned Scientists outlined the possibilities. They're left over from the Manhattan Project. They're the last people you want to be trusting, by the way. It's the Union of Unconcerned Scientists, as I like to call them, because that's exactly who they are. They refuse to acknowledge Fukushima has melted down. And every author, at one point or another, I had to email them that picture and ask them how come they don't talk about that. Why is the media pretending they're in a building, Reactor 40 lift, that doesn't even exist in 2013? It's one of the most troubling pictures you'll ever see. And this is the Donny plant. With news that a third reactor, Japan's Fukushima Daiichi, this is the 15th, nuclear power plant exploded early Tuesday morning. Experts continue to debate the possible outcome of a core meltdown and a leak of radioactive material. And using the word leak when the things are detonating and melting down is troubling on its own. From any of the three reactors. And the watchdog group, the Union of Unconcerned Scientists, they're not a watchdog group, though. They're the actual industry. And if you go look up the Union of Unconcerned Scientists and you look at who their staff is, you see them, they're ex-White House, ex-Pentagon, ex-regulatory agencies that are active. Experts question whether spent fuel stored on site in the Japanese plant might also pose a threat. Now, on the 15th, it was anybody who was honest knew the fuel pools of Reactor 1 and Reactor 3 were gone for sure. And then the Union of Unconcerned Scientists absolutely unequivocally knew exactly that particular issue. They knew they were gone. Though hard to determine the danger in Japan as the disaster is ongoing, well, it's not hard to determine when the pictures were published on March the 14th of Reactor 3 detonating, which was a plutonium mixed oxide fuel site. The Mark I reactors, like the Fukushima Daiichi plant, spent fuel is located in the cooling pools in the reactor's attic at the top of the buildings. For exploding units, reactors, which have blown off their roofs and walls, these buildings, it's just disgusting that they would say something, they would frame that narrative that way. Is there any radiation releases got to get to the environment? So this is the next day after this blew up, and that the pictures of the detonation, if not the videos, were published everywhere. And there's no way they didn't see that picture. So for the Union of Unconcerned Scientists to suggest anything else, I don't understand how that's not criminal. And how they can even look each other in the face again. For exploding units, which have blown off their roofs and walls, the problem is clear. Is there any radiation got released? Of course, it was 4 decades worth. He compares the scenario with radiation releases from fuel in the core protected by the containment building, which would reduce the amount of radioactivity that reaches the public. Protected by the containment building. There's nothing contained. The fuel pools are always hemorrhaging radiation up to those skinny stacks. A consulting professor at Stanford Center for International Security Cooperation, James Braun, noted that though the spent fuel pools are in fact exposed in the top of the reactor buildings, which no longer have roofs, well, it doesn't have reactor cores or fuel pools. The key is the water level in the pools. The pools must continuously have water pumped into them, and it has to be circulated the entire time. And if the water level goes down, the gamma radiation from the fission product contained in the fuel is not attenuated by the water cover, might escape into the atmosphere. Well, it's not just going to be gamma. The gamma radiation from the fission products contained in the fuel is not attenuated, it's not protected, it's not covered, right? By the water cover, so then the fuel will melt down immediately. By the water cover, it might escape into the atmosphere. He noted that these pools usually need about 5 meters of water level above the spent fuel. You need 15 feet of water over the fuel to block the radiation from reaching the atmosphere. So you need 15 feet of water to shield the emissions. Not the isotopes, but just the gamma shines, the X-rays, the neutron bombardments. If the water level in the pool recedes down to the point where the spent fuel assemblies are partially exposed, then partial melting of the spent fuel might occur, thus releasing some of the fission products from the spent fuel into the external environment. The external environment is the air you breathe. The fuel pools are at the top of the building, so is the reactor core. Let me explain that a little bit better for you, maybe. So the reactor core, that's the lid right there. So most of the reactor core is up at the top of it because they're 12 feet long and 18 pounds. So 12 feet down from here, basically. And so once that, which is right by the fuel pool is below the top of it, right? Because it has to be underwater to bring the fuel out of the reactor core into the pool. Which means that reactor 3, the reactor core was actually ejected out of the building and the 2 fuel pools. And notice how this one over here is actually empty, but it's not. It's completely full because you don't have a repository anywhere in the world, let alone Japan. And so the fuel, typically in all of these boiling water reactor designs, are stored in the pools because they don't have anywhere to put them. That's not an accident. And so the fuel pool has no containment and it's hemorrhaging into the environment 24/7. And they have to add 120,000 liters a day. So it's very hot. It's boiling the water at 120,000 liters a day. How long would it take you to boil 120,000 full kettles of water? Because that's what we're talking about. Each day. You know, how much energy are we talking about? It's significant. And the energy is caused by splitting atoms. Those atoms are in the water evaporates and releases the atoms into the environment. The majority, as I showed you at the beginning of last night's show, for 37 minutes, almost every single nuclear plant is surrounded by farms. Something you'll never find anywhere else on the entire planet that I'm aware of, only at my site. And when you see the pictures of all the farms I showed you last night, it's impossible to deny it any longer, hopefully. Because the spent fuel radiation heats the water surrounding it. How much heat is the fuel rods generating to boil off 120,000 kettles of water? So imagine a city with 120,000 people in it, and it's 7:30 a.m. and everybody's going to put their kettle on and boil a full kettle of water. So each day, that's what each fuel pool, there's 1,000 fuel pools worldwide, does the exact same thing each day. And we're lowballing the actual number. The number obviously is significantly higher than that, right? Because the spent fuel's radiation, which is splitting atoms, is not like radiant heat. It's not like a fireplace where you put your hands up and feel the heat, right? This heat is caused by splitting physical atoms. So how many atoms do you have to split to boil a kettle of water? I can guarantee you it's a number that you probably can't fathom. Then how many atoms do you have to split to boil 120,000 liters of water? And then how many atoms do you have to split to boil 1,000 fuel pools each at 120,000 liters? So it's 1,000 times 120,000 liters. But it's more than that. It's around 1,200 fuel pools worldwide. Because the spent fuels splitting atoms heats the water surrounding it. Constant circulation of that water is also required. The Tokyo Electric Power Company continues to monitor the temperature in these spent fuel pools. This is on the 15th. There was no monitoring of the fuel pools. Hang on, James. Hang on, James. We'll see if we can get you on the plug-in here. I hope that works. Hi, James.
Mr. Dana.
I'm going to put the headphones on.
Machida Machada.
Machida Machada. I'm going to...
Machida. Tokyo Bureau.
He's
no,
after
I just had to call in. I had to call in because it just reminded me of something. I just saw not too long ago. CEO of NewScale had a video that I ran across, and it was interesting because NewScale doesn't exist, right?
Right.
Like they went under.
Yeah,
and so here's this. So the CEO is doing this little interview with a reporter about how great NewScale is. Got a you know how CEOs are. They're just.
I seen that one a bit. Sure. Go ahead, James.
Did you see that? Yeah, like the thing that got me the most was that he's trying to sell this point that there's these decommissioned coal plants out there, and they could put a little SMR in the coal plant, and then they could preserve all the jobs.
Yeah,
like he was trying to make that as a valid business point. He was going off about how, these workers, we went in there, we cross-referenced all their material and, tried to do knowledge transfer into what they'll have to learn on SMRs. And that kind of dawned on me. I'm like, wait a minute. Wasn't the whole point of SMRs plug and play?
That's
what is this?
Yeah.
There's a lot of training involved in the coal plant, vastly, you would think, right? And so it's already ringing alarm bells, but more importantly, because I've watched you for so long and all your viewers, we could catch on to this nonsense. What this guy is saying. He's trying to sell this idea to investors, and they don't know what the hell's going on. It all sounds good to them.
They spent a lot of money. The investors threw money at them for 5 or 6 years, and now the investors are suing them, right? So, but that's the government is back in NewScale, right? So they partnered up with a number of different countries right away, but then that just went silent, right? After that, it was just posturing, I would imagine. But they didn't even try to build a reactor. They were just grabbing money. That was the game, I would imagine. Right. Go ahead, James. I'm sorry.
But any of your viewers would catch it right away. It's like, well, wait a minute. If you're so concerned about the fact that these people live in these locations where these coal plants are, and that's where they grew up, and you want them to stay there, and blah, 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 good for the economy and everything. But what if something goes wrong? Then none of these people can come back to where they grew up. So you just made it worse for their life. At least if there was another coal plant job, they can just move over there and then come back on vacation. They can't do that if you guys have messed up something here. But then more importantly, So it's just so transparent. Now you just see these lies that these, even these corporate leaders.
They are 100%.
But so this reporter tosses this other question about, what are the challenges, and so he brought up the waste, right? He said, well, yeah, the nuclear waste problem, but the way I see it, it's unused energy. That's the way he put it. He put it like that. Like there's like this promise that it's like after all these decades, you can't figure it out already. You should get it out of your mind. It's almost like, parallel to some kind of analogy that I kind of thought of, like the meatloaf that's in the back of the refrigerator that's been there for 15 weeks or so. You just call that unappreciated cuisine. It's the same kind of nonsense. It's insane. I don't know.
It's quite a trick, right? The idea is, and in one sense, like the fuel contains a lot of energy, but because it's gone through a chain reaction, it's no longer fit to be used ever again for anything, right?
Right.
Yeah. And they're because the new scale, as I'm not sure if you mentioned, I kind of lost track, but new scale's reactors are meant to work on 15% weapons grade uranium, highly enriched mixed oxide fuel uranium. So they're trying to sell that as a birthday cake instead of as a shot in the back of the head, which is what it really is, right? You're being executed when they start those things up. If you live within 100 miles of it, it just takes a long time to die, right?
It's just insanity, and I just had to call in because I just wanted to touch base off that. I just thought it was just,
No, I'm glad you did because that's great stuff. People need to realize they're scared.
But as long as operations along, Jeff, I guess all that could be, I was trying to think about that too. It must be the nuclear industry paying YouTube to make sure nobody watches this.
Yeah, 100%, eh? Like,
because imagine if enough people kind of understood the scam here and we're watching all this destruction. It's all making sense because you're not telling lies.
No, that's for sure.
This is all happening.
Yeah. I'm just not like I say again, like those that are here are aware, but it's not that hard to learn, right? Because I got so much better at telling the story and articulating it with the documentation. That if I did have an audience, it wouldn't take long that the nuclear industry wouldn't have a leg to stand on. It really wouldn't, right? And if a nuclear student
not at all.
If a nuclear student watched this, he probably is not going to go to. He's going to change. He's going to change his. He's not going to work in a nuclear.
Well, their medication. Their medication, obviously, is going to have to change. But that's all I had to say, Dan. Let me let you go. You have a lot to cover. So much. Thank you so much. Love you, brother. Thank you so much.
Love you too, my friend. Thank you. Okay, that's James Lucid, everybody. Thank you, James. That's James Lucid. You know him from the comments section, of course, and as if you're around a long time, you know he's one of the best friends to Earth out there, literally and figuratively. Steadfast all these years, never wavered. Tokyo Electric Power Company. Let's go back to that. I'm really happy with the phone setup now that we're piping it directly in. I'm still learning, and I didn't have them plugged in that time, so it's because I don't think I'll hear the phone ring, and if I unplug it, you'll get static in the background. Let me unplug it for 1 second so I show you what I mean. If I leave it unplugged, you can hear the static in the background. Now I'll unplug everything, and there's nothing in the background, right? So I can't, I gotta work on it. I just haven't worked on it enough to resolve it. Tokyo Electric Power Company continues to monitor temperature in the spent fuel pools. Well, you can't monitor, and what was the date on this, the 15th? Yeah, the 15th. So the buildings were detonated and gone at this stage. And when number 1 blew up, especially given Tuesday and Wednesday fires in the reactor number 4 building. And let me bring up those pictures. Because I got, I transferred TEPCO's 2,000 pictures. So we had fires in Reactor 4 building. Oh, I smurfed that up, did I? So the fires in Reactor 4 were detonations. These weren't just fires. Tuesday and Wednesday fires in the Reactor 4, number 4 building. The fires, now the Reactor core number 4, they partially removed some of the fuel. They were doing a fuel change and maintenance, which meant they removed maybe 1/3 of the reactor core. So the other 2/3 of the reactor core were still in the reactor. And that the fuel pools at the top of the buildings, these are 65-meter, 190-foot buildings, 19-story buildings. And so it caused that kind of damage to... let me explain this a bit better to you. So, I can't even remember the proper name, I'm brain dead. So this spanner between these two, you can turn an SUV around on that, a big SUV. That's how big they actually are. So it's very deceiving when you look at the building because it's not your typical 19-story building, right? Tuesday and Wednesday's fires in the reactor number 4. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the worst of the worst that humanity ever created, has published the rising temperatures in the pools of reactor 4, 5, and 6. Rising temperature 4, 5, and 6 on the 16th of March 20. So on the 16th of March, there was no reactor 4 fuel pools whatsoever, or reactor 3, or reactor 1, or reactor 2. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, we covered that a lot last week with the Freedom of Information Act releases of how they sold your soul for the nuclear industry. They sold it basically for a cup of coffee. The difference, he explained, is that the core would release a lot of short-lived radioisotopes. Yeah, but it releases a lot of long-lived too. Plutonium, uranium, americium, neptunium, strontium. And the biggest byproduct of radiated fuel rods is the curium isotopes, causing more fatalities in the first year. Well, it's not just fatalities, there's heart, liver, lung, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid, adrenaline, Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, diabetes, Down syndrome, schizophrenia. There's many illnesses and diseases, not immune deficiencies and injuries and illnesses. And then in the first year, there was incredible diseases showed up. Bring that up very quick for you. So in the first year, there was 865,000 cancers in 2012. And by the Japanese National Cancers, extra cancers. Not everybody got health care. Not everybody was diagnosed. Not everybody was feeling sick. Not everybody got cancer. Right? Just heart problems, liver, lung, respiratory. And in 2019, there was a study released showing congenital malformations was at 14.2% per 100,000 live births for neonates and infants. Needed open heart surgery. 14,200 out of every 100,000 children born needed open heart surgery. They hit it, of course, but we have the numbers. Ellen Vacco, the UCS Nuclear Energy and Climate Change Project Manager. So she's the Nuclear Energy and Climate Change Project Manager. So they're associating nuclear energy as some kind of redeeming qualities for climate change, which is completely dishonest. It would be naive to think that the events in Japan will have no impacts on the nuclear industry in this country, she said. She's talking about the United States. It would be naive to think that the events in Japan would have no impacts on the nuclear industry. He believed that other designs like the Mark III reactor, which stores the spent fuel at ground level, might be less vulnerable. Well, like when they built the Mark IV reactors with the fuel pools at the top of the buildings, the Americans have over 70 of those particular designs currently running, right? Like you had to know that was the stupidest thing conceivable, was to put the fuel right above the reactor core. And if there's an issue, you can never retrieve the fuel from the fuel pools. And because you don't have a repository, they're stuffed to over capacity because they changed the definition of storage, because normally you would keep the fuel quite far away from each other so they didn't interact and cause a criticality in the fuel pool. And so they changed that definition in order to allow them to store them closer, and then able to put more, much more into a fuel pool, which means the fuel pool was going to boil off much quicker. It was going to release much more radiation into the surrounding environment at a continuous, sustained amount. And then long after the site was closed down, those fuel pools are still hemorrhaging radiation into your environment. And like, I'll go back to the small modular reactors, to James's phone call, or Lucid's phone call earlier. I meant to mention it when he was talking, and I said I'll wait till after, and then I forgot. The studies from former nuclear regulatory people that are now working in British Columbia, Canada, and the students and everything, was showing that the small modular reactor was going to be used in the mixed oxide fuel, high assay, what's known as high assay, weapons grade. But it showed that the small modular reactors in scale were going to produce 30 times more, or 5 times more very high level waste, fuel rods themselves, because there is not economics as a scale, it's less efficient, right? And that, but when you scale it up to the same megawatts as a large reactor, you produce 4 or 5 times more fuel, and we're talking about mixed oxide fuel, the worst of the worst. It produced 30 times more high-level waste and 35 times more low-level waste. But low-level waste from a mixed oxide fuel site, reactor fuel, is very high-level waste compared to a typical reactor, because it's already gone through a chain reaction. And so NuScale's reactors, for instance, we're going to be producing 480 megawatts, 6 of them, right? And that was going to cost over $20 billion, which is double and triple the typical reactor price of a large. So they could have built 6 times the power of normal large nuclear reactors for the same money that they allegedly were going to build, or the wattage they were going to build with $20 billion for half the megawatts. And they didn't even try to build a reactor. They just milked all the investors. They didn't even buy land. They didn't even, because you're talking about, and they were going to build it at, I believe it was Los Alamos National Laboratory, the original ones, or one of the national laboratories. And so NuScale milked their investors. They should have never been on the stock market on top of that, right? Because they didn't have a product. It was a total Ponzi scam, and we see that with all the other small modular reactors, like the TerraPower Bill Gates's. It's another scam, right? And geothermal could do everything that a small modular reactor can do, and it can do it right away, and it can do it better, and it can do it for next to nothing. And so if they took the same money that NuScale was going to spend on a reactor and use it in geothermal, you can probably produce 10 times more power than NuScale was going to create, and 10 times quicker. The idea, I think, because we cover this a lot, it looks like what the nuclear industry is trying to do is scuttle the renewable industry, because they know something we don't know, I would imagine. The news from Japan only grows worse day by day. At 6:10 Tuesday morning, this is the 16th or the 15th? I got to go all the way back up and find that story. That's the 15th of March we're talking about right now. Oh, we're into this story. This story. No, we're at that other story. If something was to happen to one of the fuel pools releasing radioactive contents in the air, there'd be a lot of people in harm's way. And it would be shame on us for allowing that to happen. But it did happen, and it happened 4 different times at the same site. Chernobyl was a single reactor. It didn't have any fuel pools. It was a new reactor. And it was mostly graphite, which is nowhere near as toxic as uranium plutonium, which Japan's reactors were pure uranium, pure plutonium reactors. So their inventories were at least each reactor core, not counting the fuel pool, but each reactor core was 100 Chernobyls in the animosity equivalent of uranium plutonium. So we're still at 15th of March. Latest blast at Japan's crippled nuclear plant raises fear and radiation levels. That's where we left off. So, okay, so this is incredible stuff. The news from Japan only grows worse day by day. At 6:10 Tuesday morning, local time, a blast was heard inside the number 2 reactor building at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which is the number 1 nuclear power plant. The Daiichi is number 1, the Daini is number 2 power plant. They're the twins. And then at 9:38, a blast was heard and a fire broke out in the number 4 reactor building. The number 4 reactor building is right behind reactor 3. And right on the other side of reactor 3 is number 2, and on the other side that was reactor number 1. So you had number 1 blew up, number 3 blew up, number 2 blew up, number 4 blew up. And we're at the 15th, which is 4 days after the tsunami. So Chernobyl doesn't belong in this discussion because it's puny compared to each of these reactors. And these reactors had decades of reactor fuel stored at the top of the buildings. They're gone too, obviously. So in my estimates, because I'm honest, it's about 4,000 Chernobyls. And it was about 30 plus reactor cores confirmed that melted down. But there's considerable speculation, if you're honest, that reactor 6 had lost a lot of its inventory. That's reactor 6. So these pictures came out. Let me go to... Okay, so this is quite a ways north of the site. Because reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4 were close together. And reactor 5 and 6 were separated. So that's reactor 5 is the closest one. And 6 is the furthest one up there. And so when I zoomed in on it, these pictures were released in 2021, just before the 10th anniversary. It was 736 pictures, I believe it is. I've done a presentation, you'll find it in my playlist, of those pictures from a drone. And when I zoomed in on the drone, I started noticing that the buildings were pixelated. And as I zoomed in even closer, I realized reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4 and the common spent fuel pool were completely pixelated. But also reactor 6 and the pump house was completely, and the stack. So the stack is over there, which vents the fuel pools. Reactor 6 was completely pixelated. Why would you do that? Why did they release these pictures on a TEPCO's website, no less? I found it on a Chinese site, story, that had showed up that day, and I translated the story, and they were talking about these pictures. When I went to the bottom of it, they were linking to TEPCO's web pages, so I went over and downloaded all the pictures, and I didn't know what I was looking at originally. So when I zoomed in, I noticed everything was pixelated, and every single picture that was showing the common spent fuel pool, reactor 1, 2, 3, 4, and reactor 6 were completely pixelated. And I don't know why, but I'm assuming they melted down too. Or they certainly had a lot of inventories that were lost. As a result of these, Reactor 4 and number 2, radiation levels near the plant have risen dramatically. In a televised live address to the nation, Prime Minister Nato Khan warned that substantial amounts of radiation were leaking. Now remember, this is what the site looked like. That's not leaking, see? And if you go back in history, in every accident, every nuclear accident, no matter how much damage, they're going to use the word leaking. It's unbelievable that they're that coordinated to be evil. Substantial amount of radiation leaking is an unbelievable betrayal to use the word leaking. So TEPCO workers were making every effort to prevent further explosions. Well, you couldn't do nothing because you had multiple detonations. There was no TEPCO workers. On Tuesday, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yukio Edano, unbelievable betrayal, told reporters that because the dangerous levels of radiation have been detected close to the reactor buildings, people living 20 to 30 kilometers from the plant should stay indoors and shut all windows. And that's the opposite of what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to run away. And in hindsight, that area they're talking about, that's where they picked up 30 million one-ton bags of radiation. 30 million. It's hard to comprehend how evil this industry actually is. We can't find a single redeeming quality to the industry. Let me give you an explanation of some of that first before I move on. The only way to describe the industry is insane. That would be the appropriate way to describe this industry, is insane. It's literally insane. Okay, so 20 to 30 kilometers, like they're still growing food right alongside the 1-ton bags of radiation within sight of the nuclear meltdowns and shipping it to your country. You're guaranteed to get sick from this, and it's a permanent sickness. So in Beggs itself in 2019, they admitted they had 105,000 sites where they were storing bags of radiation. 105,000 sites. And they were abandoning communities 30 kilometers away. These communities, they were telling people to shelter in place, are the same communities they ended up abandoning. They had 105,000 sites of 1-ton bags of radiation. And they knew, like, they were lying on purpose. He called it a precautionary measure, but on the 6th to 15th, you had reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4 had detonated. This wasn't a precautionary measure. And added that the laundry left outside to dry should not be brought indoors. It should never be brought indoors. It should be disposed of. And how do you take this highly radioactive laundry and put it in a garbage bag is a question I can't answer. I have a ton of experience on this subject. I can't give you an honest answer how you're not going to be impacted. Because in order to take the laundry off your clothesline, it's going to get shook a bit, right? And you're going to be blanketed in radioactive fallout. If you live in that environment, even if you visited it there today, you should take all your clothing and throw it away and shave your head right away. And your ears and your nose and everything like this, your eyebrows. Because that will, radiation will follow you everywhere. And then when you go home, if you wash with your hair or your eyebrows and everything like that, you're going to spread the radiation even further into your body. And if you bring your clothes home and put it in your washing machine, you're going to contaminate your washing machine and all clothing forever that you put into it. And your bath towels and your face cloths and everything are going to become radioactive. This is a despicable industry that doesn't really There's no checks and balances whatsoever, so there's no incentive not to be evil. And now the current generation is so evil. Laundry left outside to dry should not be brought indoors. Radiation readings taken near the reactors at 10:22 on Tuesday morning showed that emissions range from 30 millisieverts an hour to 40 millisieverts per hour. Like, if you're 5 miles away, it's going to be higher than that. If you're right by the buildings, you got a lethal dose immediately. These are lethal doses, not 30 millisieverts to 400 millisieverts per hour. It's lethal doses. This is not a conjecture or an opinion. This is a fact. And the figures are far higher than the microsievert numbers that have been reported over the past several days, which were criminal to report such a low number, by the way. When steam, this wasn't steam was vented, this was meltdowns from the endangered reactors to reduce pressure. You couldn't vent anything. And you couldn't vent anything for obvious reasons. I'll show you those obvious ones just to make sure you're on the right page. First off, you had a tsunami run through the site. So you had multiple tsunamis coming in. The first one is coming in, it's doing major damage, right? But it slows down. It's coming in at around 400 miles per hour. When it hits the coastline, it rises up, it loses some of the energy, but not all of it. The next one is coming in on top of that. The next one is coming in on top of that. This is most likely the first one. In fact, I know it's the first one because I have the sequence of pictures. Let me see if I can bring it up for you. Yeah, there it is. So these pictures are in sequence, hopefully. And so you got the tsunami. You can see right now the tsunami is just coming in. And then now the tsunami, you can see it's starting to bury the vehicles, starting to ingress further. Now you can see the spray you can see the turbulence too. Look at the incredible turbulence because it's coming short at such a high speed. And now the second wave is there too, right? And so when you look at the sequence, everything is torn apart right away. This picture really does tell a story. I don't know how good it shows up on your end, but that picture does tell a story. That kind of turbulence, you know, if you think about whitewater rafting, still doesn't compare to what you're looking at. And then when the second wave comes in, it kind of slows down the turbulence because it's going way into the country. You're talking about the whole country is being hit with this enormous energy. For comparison's sake, the BBC reported that the average nuclear employee's radiation limit is 20 millisieverts per year, and that workers not directly involved in emergency operations have been evacuated due to the levels of danger. Well, they ran away. When number one detonated, they had to run away. You can't stay on the site. The fuel pool detonated. The reactor obviously detonated, caught fire, melted through the containment. The containment detonated because it's 1,000 plus psi. And then that caused the fuel pool above it to melt and detonate at the same time. But Edano stressed that the radiation levels decreased the further away one was from the plant. Well, of course it did. The heat decreases the further you get away from the fire. That's true. But the reality of it is, it didn't decrease by that much. Let me explain that to you. Because we're talking about radioactive fallout. And we're talking about from multiple reactors and multiple fuel pools. This model is based on 1 million to 10 million atoms per cubic meter of air, cesium-137 from the French government. The model is based upon 9 days of radioactive fallout. Or no, this one is based on 30 days of radioactive fallout. This is around 30 days right here, I think. Yeah. So that's 30 days. That's the 12th of April, which is 30 days. So let me just go backwards to 20 days, for instance. Right there. So that's 20 days of radioactive fallout. So when they say radiation levels drop the further you went away from the plant, this model shows per cubic meter the entire planet was 1 to 10 million atoms of cesium-137. But it can't be just cesium-137. But that was the model was based upon, and this was a study too, was based on that particular isotope. But the plume would have been covering the entire planet in 20 days, would have been saturated with the entire inventories of isotopes. So making a broad statement that the further away from the plant, the decrease the further it is, well, that's true in lethal doses, like immediate lethal doses, but ultimately the whole planet is now buried perpetually, and because it's never stopped hemorrhaging out of there on top of that, and because there was multiple detonations, multiple nuclear meltdowns. The blast heard in number 2 reactor building occurred near the unit's suppression pool. Why would you have a blast in the suppression pool? Now we know Unit 2 liquefied too, which helped maintain the proper level of pressure in the reactor and supplied water to the emergency core cooling system. And Edano, which has been proven repeatedly here tonight to be a anti-human, anti-species, anti-planet scumbag, added TEPCO's continued to inject seawater into the system, which is simply not true. This is day 15. You got 4 melted reactors and 8 fuel pools have detonated. You are not injecting water into a system, first off, because a tsunami ran through the site, so that ability no longer exists. And second off, you had multiple reactors detonate. So there was no way to survive. According to TEPCO's insanity explanation, the valve to vent the steam and reduce pressure inside the reactor had closed, and that the closed valve caused high pressure that prevented workers from injecting more seawater to bring the temperatures down. And the residual heat in the reactor boiled away some of the water that was present and caused water levels in the reactor to drop. According to the Japan broadcaster, which is the government mouthpiece, NHK, the fuel rods were fully exposed for 6.5 hours on Monday evening. Well, if fuel rods are exposed for a few minutes, they melt down. They catch fire and they burn at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. That ignites the plutonium uranium, which burns at around 9,000. We don't have anything can contain 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Engineers were trying to open the valve when the blast occurred, and TEPCO said it could not deny the possibility that fuel rods were melting. Like, if the fuel rods are exposed for 6.5 hours, that's simply not true. They're exposed for about 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and then you're going to have a detonation. Experts also worried that the blast in number 2 reactor building could have damaged the containment vessel. And again, the explosion to the right was public the day before, so they knew there was no containment, they knew there was no reactor, and it's the same thing for reactor 1. They knew there was no containment, they knew there was no fuel pools, they knew there was no reactors. They knew it was gone the minute they seen these pictures. And these pictures, both of these pictures were widely publicized by the 14th, and we're talking about the 15th. On Tuesday, the company said it was again trying to fill the reactor vessel with seawater to cover the fuel rods. Again, this is absolutely not true because you threw fuel rods all over the site and reactor cores and fuel assemblies, all over, millions of pounds of it too, all over the site. You could not survive in that environment. The tsunami ran through the site, which disabled everything, nothing excluded. A fire, meanwhile, broke out in number 4 reactor building. That reactor had been shut down for routine maintenance, which meant 2/3 of the fuel was still in the reactor core, and the fuel pools were full. And reactor 4 is the one they say didn't melt down, but of course, when you look at the evidence, it's clear it was melted down immediately and lost its entire inventories immediately. Edano said TEPCO suspects that the spent fuel stored at the reactor building's fourth floor reheated and caused a hydrogen blast that started the fire. Reheated, caused a blast that started the fire. And let's bring up a picture from the original first few weeks. One more time. Because I moved TEPCO's pictures. So I can... The hard drive that I'm using is the fastest hard drive I got. So the fuel pools and the reactor cores are gone. In order to do this kind of damage, it's evidence that it's gone. Not maybe gone, but it's gone. But we have... Bear with me, I got the wrong one there at that time. When you look at the 2013 pictures, because I like to use that. Do this again. Here we go. They're where they're supposed to be. I just wasn't looking there. So that's reactor 4. There is no fuel pools. There is no reactor cores. That's reactor 3. There is no fuel pools. And there is no reactor core. This is not up for debate whatsoever. And at this point, they all knew this. When they seen those explosions, they knew it was gone. And they also knew that any other reactor buildings close by would have been gone. And behind reactor 4 was the spent fuel pool, which was this side behind towards me. And that was the same height as reactor 3 and 4, which meant the tsunami ran through that also. They didn't extinguish the fire because you can't extinguish. You just couldn't do that. You can't extinguish a nuclear meltdown. It doesn't work that way. Engineers found that the temperature of the cooling pool holding the spent fuel had risen 84 degrees Celsius, twice the usual temperature, which in their version is 183 degrees Fahrenheit. But the experts were told this is on the 15th. There is no fuel pools. There is no way to measure it. You can't get close to it. And that on the 14th, the day before this, reactor 4 and 3 were completely gone. There is no measuring fuel pools. And that those releases, that was the original cover. They immediately told lies. Every facet of the story, right from the very inception, the very beginning of it, they lied. And that lie is still going strong today, and there's no resistance. In a news conference on Tuesday afternoon local time, Edano told reporters number 1 and number 3 reactors in the Daiichi 1 Fukushima nuclear plant were now getting stable supplies of water, and that the water was being injected into the number 2 reactor. This is on the 15th, so this is simply, unequivocally impossible. And the date on that is the 15th of March. So there's no way that you were supplying water to anything, period. He confirmed that the fire in number 4 reactor building was extinguished, but how do you extinguish fire in a building that no longer exists? And so radiation levels is 400 millisieverts per hour. It's more like 400 sieverts per hour because you ejected the reactor core and the fuel pools from the buildings. We're now down to just below 600 microsieverts, which is 0.6 of a millisievert. And after a nuclear meltdown, like outside, we know outside of reactor 1 was 1 million sieverts per hour. Bear with me. It's just such a dishonest industry. After all these years, dishonesty seems to be the way of the samurai. June the 6th, they confirmed full meltdowns at all 3 reactors. Well, we don't need that. We know just by looking at the picture, there is no reactor core in reactor 3. There is no fuel pools. And when you look at reactor 4 and everything I showed you, that's the only assumption you can come up with. On the 15th of March, they had another large earthquake in Tokyo. And that the Homoka nuclear power plant had not been unduly affected, and that the plant did not go into emergency shutdown. However, the power company is reporting that many of its electric utility poles were knocked over from the earthquake on the 16th. And there was hundreds of aftershocks following the devastating 9.0 magnitude earthquake on Friday. And notice that there was 45 aftershocks with a magnitude of 6.0 or greater. Now, when Japan tells you magnitude, remember their scale is actually the Shindu scale, which is 1 to 7. And so we've caught them using the 6.0 magnitude when it was actually a 6.0 Shindu scale, which is an 8.5 on the Richter scale. They're the most dishonest I've come across in all these years. We've been at this for 22 years now, 23 years. This is the most dishonest industry you'll ever come across. The Japanese nuclear emergency timeline. So this is, now we're just going to do a recap. So I'm just going to walk through this because there's quite a lot there. But if I don't try to bring in all kinds of evidence, I don't think it's necessary. I might bring in some, but so let's just run through this again. Friday the 11th of March 2011, 2:46 p.m., an earthquake 130 kilometers off the coast of Miyagi Prefecture. Northeastern Japan shakes the country, and the tsunami wave as high as 10 meters, 30 feet. It's actually reached 140 feet heights in some places where it funneled inland. Emergency diesel generators at Fukushima shut down as a result of the tsunami, forcing cooling pumps to start using battery backup. So once the tsunami came in there is no battery backup, right? When that came through, there's no battery backup. There's no backup, nothing is going to work. And TEPCO uses mobile electric generators to help power the cooling system. Once that came through, there is nothing there. Now, you got to appreciate what the country looked like after the tsunami. So they're talking about March 11th, right? They're talking about day one. So on day one, the tsunami came in, and when it went back out, it left this behind. There's nothing functional anymore. And a lot of the country looks like this or that. There's nowhere to plug an extension cord in, let's put it that way. At 6 p.m. on March 11, 2011, the day of the tsunami, TEPCO announced an increase in reactor containment vessel pressure in Fukushima Daiichi 1 reactor. The number one officials decided to vent the reactor to lower pressure. Well, you can't vent the reactor because this whole site was destroyed. And James Lucid made a great point right there at that time. There's not enough car batteries in the parking lot to spin up 1 million gallons a minute, which is what it needs. It needs 4,500 tons a minute. Well said, James. Thank you. Japanese government issued a state of emergency at 7 p.m., and officials evacuated thousands of people living within a kilometer radius of the plant. Which reminds me, I should bring up the poll again. Hang on. Did the nuclear industry cover up the Fukushima nuclear meltdowns because radioactive fallout is a bioweapon? And that's how you should perceive radiation fallout, as a bioweapon. Japanese government issued a state of emergency and officials evacuated thousands of people living within a 3-kilometer radius of the plant. They didn't evacuate them. They told them to evacuate. But remember, they never had no power to get that message, right? They never had no TV, no radios, no electricity. So the majority of them never got the message. They didn't go around knocking on doors because tsunami just tore apart the country. 18,000 people were dead. Hundreds of thousands were sitting on roofs in adverse conditions. So Saturday, March the 12th, the next day, 9 a.m. in the morning, which is still not 24 hours yet, preparation for air venting from Fukushima Daiichi reactor number 1 begins. Again, you can't vent because the tsunami ran through your site. At 3:36 p.m. on the 12th of March, blast and white smoke, this is still not 24 hours, comes from the Fukushima Daiichi number 1 reactor, blowing the roof and upper part of the outer walls of the structure containing the reactor. No, this was the reactor and the fuel pools detonating. This wasn't a... And I really, I get upset every time I hear the word roof and walls, because clearly that's not what happened. This was clearly a meltdown and the loss of the inventories of the fuel pools, which are decades of reactor cores. And TEPCO says that the primary containment vessel remained intact. And TEPCO, the reason TEPCO is left in charge, figuratively speaking, so you blame TEPCO instead of the nuclear industry and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the architect of these laws, by the way. Right, the only thing that Edano is repeating is whatever the International Atomic Energy Agency told him to repeat. TEPCO says that the primary containment vessel remains intact and 4 plant safety workers are injured. 3:36 p.m. TEPCO begins venting steam to reduce the growing pressure inside of reactor number 1. Radiation density around the structure rises to 1,000 microsieverts, a millisievert, and falls to 70 microsieverts by 6:48. This was after the detonation. The numbers go down instead of up. So it was most likely 70 sieverts, say, or 700 sieverts, or 7,000 sieverts, but not microsieverts. 7:11 p.m. on March the 12th, Saturday, because it happened on a Friday, so this is the next day, Saturday, slightly one day later now. Japanese governments evacuated local residents within 20 kilometers of the plant. But remember, not everybody very few people, if any, had power. So they couldn't hear the evacuation on the radio, they couldn't hear it on TV, and their cell phones wouldn't have been working. The Japanese authorities prepared to distribute iodine to the residents. This is a fantasy that I've heard many times over the years, but I've never actually seen any documentation suggesting that they actually did that. And there's no proof they actually did it. And when you look at their legacy, it's hard to believe they would even say it because they're such dishonest people. They really are dishonest people, right? They're a blight on humanity in many ways. 8 o'clock p.m., TEPCO announces radiation exposure of 1 employee who was working inside the Fukushima Daiichi 1 reactor building exceeded 100 microsieverts. Well, nobody's inside of the Reactor 1 building at 8 p.m. on March 12th because Reactor 1 blew up. So how are you going to be inside the building? So this was the cover story cooked up by the administration at the International Atomic Energy Agency at that time. It's completely dishonest to suggest somebody was inside of Reactor 1. 8:20 p.m., TEPCO begins injecting seawater mixed with boron to cool the Reactor 1, which again is dishonest. Japan's Nuclear Industrial Safety Agency, NISA, detected cesium, which is a British terminology, not a Japanese, and iodine-131 near the Fukushima Daiichi 1 plant. Again, that's not what you're going to be looking for. You can find that, but that's not what That's the cover story, cesium and iodine. Yes, there's a lot of it, and it's very dangerous stuff, but that's not what was going on. Curium is the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rods, not cesium or iodine. And curium is you need lead shielding 20 times thicker than you do for plutonium, which is man-made and named after the devil. At 11 p.m. on the 12th of March, Saturday, the next day, TEPCO announced that they had been injecting seawater into the reactor core number 1 and then boric acid to absorb the radiation. Current reactor water levels lower than normal in reactor 2. Reactor 1 was already gone at this point, by the way. And if the water level is lower than normal in reactor 2, then that's already melting down. Sunday the 13th, TEPCO completes air venting in reactor number 3, which simply wasn't true, to reduce internal pressure, and then begins injecting water containing boric acid into the reactor via the fire pump, which definitely wasn't working, and given failures of high-pressure injection systems. At Fukushima Daiichi 1 workers exposed to higher than normal radiation, and 4 injured and 1 dies in a crane accident. Monday, the 14th of March, TEPCO reports to Fukushima Daiichi number 3 pressure increases, but there was no way to quantify that assertion because the whole coastline was torn out. The site was hit with over 400 mile per hour waves, and that the damage was complete, right? The damage just from the tsunami took out all the infrastructure, bar nothing. In reactor 2, on the 14th, the core coolant levels decreased and seawater pumping began, which simply is not true. At 11 a.m., 3 hours later, hydrogen explosions from reactor number 3 injured 7 workers. And this is the original pictures that they released. So these are not hydrogen explosions. These are aerosol uranium plutonium. So if you take gasoline and you put gasoline on a bunch of firewood and that, and you step back and you wait like a minute because you get all these fumes will build up, right? And you throw a piece of cardboard or something, that fire will go poof right away and then it'll burn, right? But what happened into the building was you had aerosoled uranium plutonium. So think about if you took gasoline and you were in a building and you aerosoled the whole building and then you set a spark in there, instead of the building having a big fire, now the building would just detonate because you aerosoled it, right? And this is what happened with these reactors where you aerosoled uranium and plutonium. And also the hydrogen, which was from the zirconium cladding aerosol. Once that exposed the air, that catches fire and creates the hydrogen. But at the same time, you're burning uranium plutonium. Now when you introduce oxygen, it's going to detonate. And the detonation is going to be significant. And because it's a plutonium mixed oxide fuel reactor, you expect it to burn 200,000 degree times hotter when it detonates. On the 14th, TEPCO confirmed the Fukushima Daiichi reactor number 2 cooling system has failed, and the IAEA, who I have zero respect for, reports 230,000 units of stable iodine distributed to evacuation centers. These are a curse on humanity, that organization is. At 5:17 p.m. on the 14th of March 2011, TEPCO reported the water levels in the Fukushima Daiichi number 1 reactor, 2 reactor remains above the fuel rods, and the company has restarted water injections. So on the 14th, this was physically impossible because of the ejections of the fuel cores from surrounding reactors. And reactor 3 had detonated, remember? So there's no way you can do that. And the pictures clearly show that you couldn't do that, what they're suggesting right there. Tuesday the 15th of March, the company reports an explosive sound in the 5th floor of Fukushima Daiichi reactor number 4. This is the fuel pool. And blast from the number 2 reactor building of Fukushima Daiichi number 1 power plant. So At 6 a.m., number 4 detonated. 14 minutes later, number 2 reactor detonated. So now you have reactor 1, reactor 2, reactor 3, and reactor 4 have detonated. And the party's over, right? It's an extinction level event at this stage for the species and humanity worldwide. Now we're being exterminated. A fire breaks out in the Fukushima Daiichi number 4 reactor building at number 9:38 a.m. So 6 a.m. you had an explosion at the top of reactor 4. At 9:38 you still have a fire going on, which is to be expected at these enormous temperatures. And Japanese authorities believe the spent fuel storage pool is burning and releasing radiation into the atmosphere, which is exactly obviously what happened, right? 9:38 a.m. a fire breaks out in Fukushima Daiichi number 4 reactor building. The International Atomic Energy Agency, who never went there until last year, reports that the Japanese authorities believe the spent fuel storage pool is burning, releasing it directly into the atmosphere. Radiation readings taken near the multiple nuclear meltdowns in 8 fuel pools that melted down show 30 millisieverts per hour to 400 millisieverts per hour. These are, first off, you're not going close enough to get a reading because that's a lethal dose. Higher than a microsievert numbers reported when steam was vented. And you didn't vent steam because the infrastructure was completely gone. Officials asked the Japanese residents 30 kilometers from Daiichi number 1 to stay indoors. And of course, not everybody had communications because power was out for many millions of people. Wednesday the 16th of March. Now, everything is already detonated multiple times. TEPCO employees discover another fire in reactor number 4 of the Fukushima Daiichi. This is the cover story is what you're reading. This is not the actual factual. 8:30 a.m. TEPCO reports a fog-like steam from Fukushima Daiichi reactor number 3. A fog-like steam on the 16th. Well, this fog-like steam they're talking about is right there, and that's a lethal dose. That whole site is a lethal dose on that date. You're not reporting nothing. You're not able to survive that environment. That's lethal doses everywhere. At 4 p.m., temperatures in the spent fuel pool of the Daiichi 1 reactor, number 4, Daiichi is the number 1 site, rather. The reactor number 4 rise. The self-defense forces considered spraying water from helicopters, but the attempt was cancelled. And all 600 helicopter pilots at Chernobyl, which is a fraction of a percent of Fukushima, all 600 helicopter pilots died. And then you're not spraying water, you're dropping water from like a water bomber type scenario from a helicopter, is a symbiotic attempt to manipulate you into thinking that they have some kind of redeeming qualities, they're able to do something. Japan's Nuclear Safety Commission recommends that local authorities instruct evacuees leaving a 20-kilometer area to take stable iodine available at the evacuation center. You got to take it 24, 48 hours before the nuclear meltdowns, not after the nuclear meltdowns. And they didn't do that as far as I know, because how many times have I covered that in the last decade? I haven't, right? Because it didn't happen. Otherwise, we would have covered it. Thursday, the 17th of March, which is way down the rabbit hole now, a self-defense force helicopter flying from the west drops the first load of water almost directly over the Fukushima Daiichi number 3 reactor. Well, that's the number 3 reactor. There's nothing left. A second helicopter flying from the east dumps its water over reactor 4 and 3. 2 more passes were made for the operations suspended around 10 a.m. on the 17th. TEPCO patrols reach reactor number 4 building to inspect the dry cast. I don't know what they're talking about. You're not, number 4 was completely gone. And the dry casts were between Reactor 4 and Reactor 5 and 6, which is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet away from Reactor 4 north, right? Also monitors common spent fuel pool located in a separate building from reactor units to confirm the water levels in the pool are secured. The common spent fuel pool was at the same height, was on the same ground level as Reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's right behind Reactor 4, and the evidence pretty clearly shows that melted down. Just bear with me, see if I can find that section. Because they released these redacted pictures, right? Oh, it's pure luck. I found them, so hang on, just let everything populate. I do believe I found them. Let's find it. We'll find it in 1 second. Yeah, that's the common spent fuel pool. So this is right behind. That's the common spent fuel pool right there. Why is that pixelated completely? And up behind it, you can see where the tsunami pushed all the transport trucks, containers, and piled them up behind it. That's what you're looking at up there. So why is the common spent fuel pool, which had... Now, the common spent fuel pool allegedly had 6,800 fuel assemblies, and each assembly is 100 fuel rods that are 12 pounds each, or 18 pounds each, and are 12 feet long. It would be like Chernobyl on steroids if the spent fuel catches fire, says nuclear engineer who worked at a Denical plant. And each reactor was holding approximately 3,450 spent fuel assemblies. Because they don't have a repository anywhere in Japan, right? And then the common spent fuel pool being sprayed with water, March the 22nd. If you didn't get water in there right away, because it contained 6,375 spent fuel assemblies, so it would have boiled off the pool in just a few days. So if you didn't put water in there until the 22nd, it's because you were trying to come up with a cover story. And so these pictures were from a drone that were released in a batch, about 736 of them in 2021. But there was nobody's ever reported on this, only me, as far as I know, and a Japanese newspaper. They didn't report on it, though. They basically just wrote a little blah, blah, blah story and directed you to TEPCO's site, where you had to download them in order to see the pictures themselves. The Chinese website didn't have any pictures. So when I downloaded the pictures, it didn't make any sense because it was a drone. So I'm zoomed in on this shot, but it's very high quality pictures. But the pictures are several thousand feet up in the air. So when you're looking at the site actually looks normal. And when you zoom in, and I'll admit that the first 7 or 8 pictures that I zoomed in on, I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. I was just looking, right? But then I zoomed way in. I started noticing the pixelation. And when I started noticing the pixelation, I had to stop. It blew my mind. I had to stop. I had to go get a cup of tea. I had to go outdoors and sit down for a minute. And then I came back in and I methodically went through 736 pictures. And everything with the reactors, the common spent fuel pool and reactor 6 were pixelated. But the dry cache storage was closer to reactor 5 and 6 than it is 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is close to the sea, though, is located more shallower than these common spent fuel pool and reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we have pictures of the common spent fuel pool post tsunami, and these buildings are ripped to pieces, which is what you would expect. How are we doing? Okay, it's 10 after. Let me just do a couple more. At 5:30 p.m., the International Atomic Energy Agency, one of the worst humans you'll ever come across, reports that engineers have begun to lay external grid power cables to the number 2 reactor. Number 2 is completely gone. And this is on, what's the date on this? Hang on. The March 17th. They reported operators are able to start one of the diesel generators, number 6. I don't believe that. At 7 p.m., riot police's high-pressure water cannon truck and self-defense forces fire engines spray more water on the stump of Reactor 3. On the 18th, self-defense forces spray water on number 3. And TEPCO reports the water levels in spent fuel pools in reactor number 4 are secure when we know for a fact the building no longer existed. I'm almost finished. TEPCO reports that they started residual heat removal system pumps in reactor number 5 to ensure the spent fuel is cooling in the pool. Again, I find it hard to believe they've done that. TEPCO reports that it had made 3 holes in the roof of number 5 reactor number 6 to prevent hydrogen gas from accumulating within the building. Well, the only reason the hydrogen gas would accumulate in the building is because you have meltdowns going on. And cutting holes is not one of the things you're going to be doing, because the spark will set off the hydrogen, right? And oxygen will too. TEPCO starts another diesel generator in Reactor 6. Now, Reactor 6, as I just showed you earlier, was completely pixelated out. So why was it pixelated out then? And why are they suggesting that? Most likely it had melted down and they've successfully covered it up. TEPCO reports temperatures have gone down in spent fuel storage pools of number 5 and 6, which we, like March the 20th, the fuel pools would have been boiled dry by this point. Radiation levels are measured at 500 meters from the number 3 reactor building, 2,625 microsieverts. Again, this is completely, the buildings have detonated. There was over 1 million sieverts outside of number 1, for goodness sakes. Hang on. On the 18th, I believe that's the 18th, TEPCO finished laying cables 2 and starts providing power to reactor number 2. There is no power to reactor 2, folks. This is completely horrific that he would say something like that. And on the 20th, the International Atomic Energy Agency reports that off-site electrical power had been connected to an auxiliary transformer and distribution panel. Again, the tsunami ran to the site. There was no distribution panels. And you got to realize how big these structures actually are. This is not something you can manhandle. It's not like a house distribution panels or something like that. These are, you need cranes and all kinds of equipment to set this up. TEPCO has injected 40 tons of seawater in reactor 2. This wasn't true. And wait for it. These numbers are completely dishonest that they're talking about. TEPCO reports that it is a 450-volt cable connected to the plant is ready to supply a central control room for the number 1, number 2 reactors, which no longer exists. So why would you connect the control rooms? And we know they didn't go back to the control rooms for 7 years, so why are they suggesting they were there then? TEPCO employees spot light gray smoke rising from the southeast side of the rooftop. There is no rooftop to Reactor 3. There's a picture of Reactor 3. There is no rooftop to the building, right? The building doesn't exist. 1/3 of the building is there, but it's not. There's nothing functional, right? There's no roof. The 22nd smoke at number 2. Just wait for it. Tokyo Fire Department. So the fire department, Tokyo Fire Department, goes into a nuclear meltdown. Not nuclear Bechtel or Jacobs or you're going to send in a fire department to a nuclear meltdown. That's heartless. This simply didn't happen, right? March 22nd, TEPCO reports electrical supplies for external sources restored to reactor number 1 to 6. And the lights turned on in the male operating room and reactor number 3 main control room. They never went back to number 3 for 7 years. 7 years. Okay, that's basically it. I'm not sure if I'm going to be back tomorrow night. I'm pretty burnt out. I mean, I'm burnt out. It's hard to appreciate how burnt out I actually am. I might be back tomorrow night, right? I might feel better by tomorrow night. I'm so burnt out, though, because I haven't stopped for weeks and weeks. Like, I literally haven't stopped for weeks and weeks and weeks. Every weekend I work full through the weekend nonstop, and it's okay, but I'm hoping I'll be back tomorrow night. I definitely feel the whole body just ran straight to the ground. And I was out working outdoors today for about 4 hours. I got the rest of the bolts into the E-tracks on the trailer, which is a big deal. And I got a bunch of work done in the shed. The shed is almost functional again. I can see one of my tables in the shed now, the top of it. Oh my. That was a great show tonight, though. I really liked the show tonight. We covered... That's such an important show tonight. The material that we covered. Because it reinforces the freedom of information falls we covered last week and this week also. Did the nuclear industry cover up the Fukushima meltdowns because the radioactive fallout is a bioweapon? And I think the answer is pretty clear that that's exactly what they done, and the reason they done it was because radioactive fallout meets all the criteria for a biological weapon. Oh, excuse me. And it's burnt out. It's okay. I'll try to get back tomorrow night, but I should take tomorrow off. I got enough sitting there to do a show tomorrow night, so I probably will show up tomorrow night, but I really should take tomorrow off and just try to recover. I don't like taking a day off because the nuclear industry is busy slaughtering all the species on our planet, and I feel guilty if I take a day off. And it's pretty... I can't really tell you the last time I took a day off. I really can't. I won't worry about it. We'll see you tomorrow night. Hopefully that shows up. Have a great night. Hugs for everybody. I apologize for being so lethargic tonight. I'm just going to go crawl into the bed. Just like I am. And get up in the morning. Hopefully I feel a lot better. Have a great night. Hugs for everybody. If you make it this far, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. It costs us very little, and it might go a long way. Take care, folks.